Hi, my name is Heath Jones, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a few moments to take care of a few housekeeping issues. The first, the usual. If you haven't yet, please like, follow, or subscribe to this podcast by way of whatever app that you use to listen. And if you find the time, please, I'd encourage you to leave some comments or some ratings. These, I'm told, will help our podcast meet and reach more people. And so if you would take the time to fill out a comment, maybe give us some suggestions or some words of encouragement, whatever is on your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Second, again, more of what you may already know, but in case you don't, this podcast is a production of Northwood Christian Church, my church where I pastor in Indianapolis, Indiana, but also in partnership with the All Indiana Podcast Network. You can learn more about Northwood or the All Indiana Podcast Network by checking out their websites, which are www.indYNCC.org and allindianapodcastnetwork.com, respectively, or you can check out wishtv.com/podcasts, and you can also find All Indiana Podcast Network that way. Third, finally, I'd like to share some things about Northwood's Christmas Eve program. This year, Christmas Eve falls on a Saturday, which I'm looking at as a really good thing because it should free up lots of people to find a church service to attend. You know, sometimes Christmas Eve will come in the middle of an already busy week. This time it's on the weekend, and so this is a good opportunity for you to attend if that's your thing. It's our thing at Northwood, and I'm a pastor after all. Of course it should be, and it's one of the most special services that we have. Ours is at 7 p.m. We will sing Christmas carols, we will light candles, and we'll listen to musical and theatrical performances, and all are welcome to attend. I should say that Northwood is an open and affirming church that accepts all people of every race, gender, sexual orientation, or any other distinction as full participants and members. So we'd love to see you there, and there will be more on that in the coming weeks. You'll be hearing me mention it because it's on my mind. But for now, we'll pause for that ad break that we take for our podcast audience. I know some of you watch on YouTube or on Facebook, but we take this break for our podcast audience. So break. And we're back to tell you that we're going over a few short verses found in the Epistle of James. Specifically, James chapter 5, verses 7 through 10. And it goes, "Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop of the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. As an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." We'll come back to those verses here in a moment. But first, I want to say something about the title of this episode, this time together, this message. I entitled it, "Waiting is Not Easy," for two reasons. First, there's those lines that began with, "Be patient." Be patient, be patient, be patient. Nobody really wants to be told to be patient because this implies that you're waiting, and waiting is not fun. So here's a rhetorical question. How fun is it to wait? Not fun, usually. Which leads me to the next reason that I named this message, "Waiting is Not Easy." If that title sounds familiar, maybe you're a parent who has this child's book in your house. This book written to the same name, "Waiting is Not Easy," by Mo Willems. And if you haven't read it yet, you should. Mo Willems is great. Little plug for him. But in his book, "Waiting is Not Easy," he puts his beloved elephant character Gerald in a predicament where he has to wait. And it's a book for kids, and it's to help them discover, along with Gerald, some helpful things you ought to know if you find yourself in a place that makes you wait. And Gerald discovers different tools, along with his help Piggy, about how to wait, because it isn't easy. Kids need to know that. Adults haven't learned that. We give our children books like these to prepare them for the reality that they will face when they grow older, which is they will spend a whole lot of their life waiting. They already are. We make them wait. The parents, make them wait. Because we're waiting. Have you had to wait lately? And I say this after a week where my wife and I had to wait in a big way. We spent, a week ago today, an evening in the emergency room. My wife had hit her head. She had a concussion. And we were advised to go to the emergency room to make sure that her head trauma wasn't more serious. And so we drove to 3 hospitals because we didn't want to wait. Every hospital we went to, it was clear we were going to be waiting for more time than we were prepared for. 2 of the emergency rooms that we stopped off at had standing room only. We spoke to one lady who told us that she had been waiting for more than 24 hours. So true or not, we could tell she was frustrated. And so later, we found a place, 4th hospital we tried, and then we became frustrated. As we settled into the emergency waiting room, the 4th hospital, as I said, and then we were right there, waiting along with everybody else. And some were handling the situation better than others. Some occasionally raised their voices, speaking their displeasure out into the room for anyone who could hear. Others were talking on their phone about their travails, talking to their friends or family members loudly, making sure everyone else can hear about the circumstance and how terrible it was to wait in that place. And this, I think, was so that we, this captive audience, could hear, bear witness to her plight. Some exercised an outsized portion of patience, people sitting quietly, minding their business, until they didn't, sitting poised, waiting, until their frustration broke out like a floodgate. All the pent-up anger, frustration, confusion. And I added confusion there because at the end, I began to think that if only the people in the waiting room, me even myself, understood, had some knowledge as to the why we were waiting. Or maybe even just some vague guesstimate. Or better still, the dream would be a countdown clock ticking down to the moment when your name would be called to go be seen by a doctor. Then we could sit through any number of discomforts. You know that you can put up with quite a lot if you see the end coming, or at least ride out the discomforts more comfortably with the assurance that this will all be better soon. But alas, we didn't receive any of that useful information, and waiting was not easy. And this may be why churches have been historically some of the most stressed out and cranky places. We in churches, church people, are tired of waiting for the world to change. And I'm not sure it gets easier around this season of Advent, because it is around this time that Christians loudly proclaim that this is the season of waiting. So goodness, where does there even need to be a season for this waiting? But the waiting is for the coming of Christ into the world, which for the Christian world means the arrival of every good thing into the world: love, joy, peace, and even our salvation. Waiting is not easy, which is why perhaps churches are stressed out places, because we have been waiting for a long time. And I'll say it again. We have been waiting for a long time, and not just for God to fully heal the world, not just for the coming of God's realm in its totality. No, we've been waiting for other things as well. Some of us have been waiting for our bodies to heal and to be made whole. Some of us have been waiting for a loved one to wake up to the errors of their ways. Some of us have been waiting for the grief to end after the death of a loved one. And it goes on, and we don't know when it stops. There are so many things that we wait for in church. And as I was going on about, waiting, it's not easy. I could say it 20 more times. It would always be true. Probably. But James has some advice for us, which is why I said probably. In regards to the frustration that waiting can generate, James has this to say to us, and I'll read it again for you, starting with verse 7. Be patient, okay. Therefore, beloved, be patient until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. Here, the writer reveals a knowledge of the region where the beginning of the growing season kicked off with an early rain, and then there was this middle part, and then you had a late rain. And you needed that late rain, I'm told, I've read, for the crops to come in right. And you could wait until after the late rain. You had to wait till after the late rain before you harvested. The question is, what to do while waiting for the later rain? Again, with the waiting. And James is comparing farmers who wait for rain to the early church who was waiting for the fullest expression of God's transformation, as we are still to this day. Still waiting. So in the meantime, if the advice to be patient doesn't help, and I don't find just that advice very helpful, be patient. Okay, how? He goes on. You also must be patient, okay? Verse 8, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Okay. Verse 9, beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the door. So do not, be patient, and then more advice. Do not grumble against one another. Do not grumble and don't judge. So what kind of advice is this? How does this help? I mean, who ever heard of people who are impatiently waiting for an undisclosed, indeterminate period of time, who received this advice and it was helpful? You know that in those places, like in the emergency room, like in church, those are the places where people are waiting and where they get snippy with one another. Again, I'm beginning to see where the church gets its reputation for being filled with a bunch of grumpy grumps. This is what one might expect in a community that has waited on so much for so long. And it's ironic that churches, communities that are supposed to be filled with people who are filled with God's joy and the peace of God, isn't it ironic that these places, our churches, have reputations for being filled with irritable, cranky, rude, and judgmental people? People describe church sometimes like an emergency waiting room. I almost want to tell James not to waste his breath or his ink trying to convince church people to stop grumbling in church. And we judge one another, we nitpick, even as we are picked apart. So we, the church, are told repeatedly in this passage to be different, to be patient. And again, verse 10 hits the same note, but then asking the church to consider the prophets of old as examples of people who endured a lot of suffering, like we endure today, like the early church did, like every generation does in its own way and in its own time. And yet, our spiritual ancestors displayed an exceptional amount of patience. Job is specifically cited later in verse 11. So verse 10 reads, as an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets. Look to those who came before. But here, if you're frustrated by this just blanket advice that may not be very helpful, how do we apply it? Here, I'm beginning to appreciate where James began in using this agricultural metaphor to describe what it is like to wait for the breaking in on God's realm. And perhaps this metaphor gives us a window into what to do in the meantime. Those present who heard these words read or read them themselves in those days would likely have known that between the early rain and the late rain, you don't simply wait around between early and late rain. It isn't as if the farmer or their family woke up each day and would scan the horizon for rain clouds and then go back inside and go to bed. No, there is always vital and important work to be done, and it makes a difference. As to the harvest, the farmer needs to weed the fields to keep the other plants from pushing out the crops. The farmer needs to do what can be done to keep the animals, safe or out of the crops if they don't belong there, rodents and the like, damaging or eating the crops. Or one may assume that the farmer has other irons in the fire. I mentioned maybe other animals that the farmer's caring for, keeping safe, livestock to attend to, birds to feed, sheep to water. My point is, farmers don't just sit on their hands and wait for the later rain. Anyone hearing this for the first, when they're hearing the advice, be patient. Okay, what do I do? They would hear this metaphor and realize that farmers stay busy at life-giving work. So what is the antidote to impatience? The grumbling mentioned in verse 9. What is the answer? The farmer knows that while waiting for the late rain, he stays busy. And in staying busy, he cultivates more life around him in the meantime. Before, the farmer was convinced that the blessing would not come until the late rain arrived. What the farmer discovers is that by staying busy, cultivating life and blessing, that farmer finds blessing even before the rain. In its best moments, the church has understood this. That the antidote to anger, frustration, and anxiety that stems from waiting for the good to grow around us, the antidote to that anger and frustration, grumbling, is to cultivate the good that grows around us already. Get busy with that. Make sure that what grows around you reaches its greatest potential, its greatest yield. And I think that this is what the verses that come later are all about. We didn't read them, but I'll read them for you now. Chapter 5 still, but skipping on to the same conversation about waiting. Verse 13. James writes, "Are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up, and anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven." So what you have here is the antidote to grumbling while waiting. What you have here in these verses is a description of a community in which its members aren't sitting on their hands waiting for their situation to improve. Right after the be patient, don't grumble advice, get busy, they're not even pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Instead, they're taking their gifts and strengths and they're giving them back to others in the community. They're helping others. They're spending their time waiting, focused on helping others. Those that can pray, they do it. Those that can sing, they share their song with the community. The leaders surround the sick in loving support. The whole while, the community is forgiving sins, holding no grudges that need not be held. What you have here is a description of a healthy community living well together. So to go back to the metaphor of early and late rains, the field workers, while waiting on the late rain, spend their time caring for the farm and the life it supports. And for the early church, this would mean that its members would come to see themselves as one body working together, something like an organism, each part serving to care for the whole. And so now I'm thinking about how different things might be like, how differently things might go in places like emergency rooms. If instead of grumbling, emergency waiting rooms, instead of grumbling, we turn to our neighbors in care and concern. How might spaces like emergency waiting rooms be transformed if the people in them had different perspectives? I mean, even kind conversations in that setting could go a long way to help us in a bleak place. So maybe that's possible in an emergency waiting room. I don't know what's possible in that place. Things are pretty dire there. Maybe there's not much we can do about it. But what about the tension, the anger, the fear, and the anxiety that sometimes lives in churches? What of the grumbling that James so passingly references here? That can be a real problem. But this is something I think that we can do something about this. And here at Northwood, we can do something about the waiting and the grumbling. Northwood has been waiting, along with everyone else, for a long time. We've been here for over 100 years, and we've waited for, lots of things. We've waited for the church to grow in different seasons. Right now, we're waiting for that. It is, a little, but we're still waiting. We've waited for the world outside to make sense. We've waited for revival and many good things, but, we've waited, and we're still waiting. We've waited through long, boring sermons. We've waited for any number of preachers to finally get to the point, or for the church to get to someplace good, period. Are we getting grumpy? You bet. We grumble in church. Don't we ever? And James knows this. True then and now. He suspects the grumbling may continue. Sometimes we grumble. Or nearly all of the time. So what to do? After all, waiting is not easy. But if we were not thinking about the waiting, but about each other, Just like in the emergency room, where the waiting could be easier as we attend to the people around us, I think that this time that we spend together in church waiting could be a bit easier to endure as we focus on attending to the needs of one another to pass the time. In fact, when the church is doing this well, we discover that we can do more than simply exist while we wait. We discover that these years together that we are spending even now are not dead time spent twiddling our thumbs waiting for what? Rather, we discover the joy that finds us in the in-between time, between the early and the late rains. So, don't wait around. Call someone up who needs to hear a word of love. Notice what needs persist in your community with a mind to meet those needs if you can. Maybe you can't. Do as much as you can do. Either way, you won't be bored. Try and learn what people near and around you are which people around you are nearly invisible. And as they are so often overlooked, notice them and let them know that you see them and appreciate them. Visit someone in the hospital if you can. Write someone a note. Ask someone over for dinner. Take someone out to lunch after church or in the middle of the week just because. Volunteer at one of the many places where the needs of the poor are barely kept up with, if at all. There's a lot of work to do in this world. Waiting may not be easy, but the good news is there's a lot of life-affirming work to do in the name of Jesus in the meantime. There's an endless amount left for us to do in this world. So let's do it together and in the name of love. An emphasis on let's do it together because none of us should need to wait alone. And once we find each other in this way, bound together by the labor of love, this waiting, really, it's not always that bad. This has been the Northwood Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen or leave a comment. These points of engagement drive more traffic our way. Or check out our website, www.indyncc.org. And also check out the other podcasts produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Northwood Podcast. I am Heath Jones. Peace.